The Rigel Black Chronicles, Book 1, The Pureblood Pretense. Chapter 12. The next morning, Rigel woke to brisk knocking on their door. They had been up past midnight celebrating Draco's spot on the house team, and she had no idea what time it was, but her internal clock professed it certainly had not been 7 hours. The knocking continued, and she slowly resigned herself to the idea that the others were not going to answer it. She moved back her hangings, exchanging a bleary-eyed look with Draco, who slept with his curtains open. He eyed her, face half swallowed by the pillow, but made no move to investigate the knocking. Knott's hand groped at the bedside table for his pocket watch. It disappeared into his bedding, and a muttered "Hell no" from beneath the sheets made his opinion on the matter clear. "You're dressed. You get it." Draco offered this solution with perfect dignity before turning his face fully into the pillow. Rigel supposed she was, at that. She rolled out of bed and shivered as her bare feet met the cold dungeon floor. Padding her way to the door, she cracked it, intending to give the knocker her firm regrets and then return to bed. Unfortunately for that plan, it was Pansy. The inhumanly awake blonde breezed past Rigel and cast the Lumos charm so brightly it elicited an immediate groan from Knott's bed. Draco began a noise of startled indignation that fizzled out when he caught sight of her. "Pans!" He ran his fingers through his hair in a hasty attempt to look dignified in his night clothes. "You can't barge into a gentleman's room first thing in the morning." At Pansy's raised eyebrow, Draco seemed to think better of scowling at her and redirected his ire to Rigel. "I told you to answer it because you're already decent. If you let the person in, it defeats the purpose." Rigel met his stare and raised him a shrug. "A gentleman never refuses a lady. More importantly, a lady never gives a gentleman the chance to." Pansy eyed the state of their dorm room with a distinctly motherly disappointment. "Why are you here, Pansy?" Not elected out of the discussion on gentlemanly behavior by remaining firmly in bed. "I'm here to ready Rigel for breakfast." "Rigel can't dress himself?" Draco waved his hand over Rigel's rumpled clothing. "Oh, wait, he already did. Mission accomplished." Pansy gave Rigel a dubious once-over. "We're doing introductions after breakfast, and I need him to look like a pureblood heir." "He is a pureblood heir," Knott said from his prostrate position of protest, "so however he looks must be how one is supposed to look. Rigel doesn't normally concern himself with conforming to more traditional aspects of style." Pansy's tone was perfectly diplomatic, which made it all the more insulting. "While he is undoubtedly accomplished in his own right, visual clues will reinforce his consequence for those who are too stupid to think for themselves." "You're introducing me to stupid people?" "No, that's not what—" At the look on Rigel's face, Pansy relented. "I'm sorry if I offended you just now, only since I'm making the introductions, your image reflects on me today." Rigel looked down at her bed-wrinkled robes. "I was going to change." "Breakfast doesn't start for another hour," Knott added. Pansy shot Draco a smug glance. Perfection takes time. Draco only groaned. "You can stay as long as you stop quoting my mother. And be quiet so the rest of us can go back to sleep." Knott cheered weakly and shut his hangings immediately. "What about me?" "Someone has to be sacrificed for the greater good." Draco closed his curtains as well, leaving Rigel to Pansy's questionable mercy. "I'm sure I can make myself presentable if you give me a chance," Rigel tried, backing away slowly. "After I show you what I want, you can try all by yourself next time." Pansy's smile was utterly simpering. "Don't worry, it will be fun." After the first hour, Rigel resolved to get Pansy a dictionary with the word fun circled and painstakingly explained. First, Pansy sent Rigel to the shower with a set of clothes and instructions to wash everything but her hair. These were not the clothes she would be wearing to her introductions, evidently. Pansy called them control clothes, and explained they would be a neutral backdrop for testing hairstyles and save the real outfit from wrinkles and water spots. Rigel showered, vaguely grateful Pansy hadn't insisted on supervising her scrubbing. She carefully wrapped her wrist with clean bandages from under the sink and dressed. The control clothes were loose and long-sleeved, at least. When she opened the door, Pansy waited with a basket of products that could put a student's basic potions kit to shame. For the second time that week, Rigel found herself bending over a sink with Pansy's hands in her hair. She didn't mind the hair washing exactly, but it felt odd. Archie had never washed her hair. After the fourth bottle, Rigel stopped trying to guess what Pansy was putting on her scalp and focused on staying still. Once she'd met whatever goalpost she had in mind, Pansy drew Rigel back from the sink and arranged her short locks about her head. When she drew her wand, Rigel held extremely still. "Are you going to cut it?" Pansy's eyes softened from their intense focus. "No, I know a charm that makes it stay perfectly still as it dries, if that's all right." Rigel nodded her acceptance, and Pansy waved her wand in a weaving motion over the carefully settled pieces. "You should never use heating charms on your hair if you can help it," she offered, perhaps mistaking Rigel's question for interest in the process. "It can damage the ends, and I suspect your texture would not take well to it." Rigel tucked that information into the void, but smiled politely as Pansy made the final tweaks to her hair. "Nails next." Rigel crossed her arms, unwilling to let Pansy get a close look at her left hand. Suspecting was one thing. There was no need to confirm anything for the girl. "My nails are fine." Pansy gave her a stern look. "You have to have clean fingernails or no one will trust you." Rigel did not hide her disbelief. "It's true," Pansy insisted. "A clean person runs a clean house, that's what people think. If you are neat and tidy in your person, then you will be seen as fastidious in all your affairs. Dirty fingernails might as well be a flag with the words, 'I have no attention to detail in gold embroidery. My father taught me that.' Certainly, that's what they would tell themselves, that it had nothing to do with classism and a prejudice against people who did dirty work for a living." Rigel told herself she was reading too much into it, but the phrase "dirty blood" kept going through her head, and she didn't think she could convince herself the connotations weren't there on a subconscious level. "I keep my nails short and clean for potions work," Rigel said firmly. It was a habit she adopted ruthlessly after an article in Potions Quarterly had painstakingly outlined the potential consequences of unintended biomatter entering a volatile potion. "At least let me confirm," Pansy insisted. Rigel presented her right hand, and after a reluctantly impressed nod, Pansy turned the offensive on Rigel's eyebrows. "Not a lot," she promised, brandishing the tweezers with a casualness that was not reassuring. Rigel grimaced through the entire process and told herself to renegotiate the limits of their friendship when she was not at the mercy of the other girl's artistic abandon. Pansy leaned back to inspect her work. "Your eyes are a little dry." Rigel dropped her gaze to the side, hoping Pansy didn't know that dryness was a side effect of prolonged magical contact usage. "I didn't sleep well. I can put some drops in." Pansy's cheeks went slightly pink and she shook her head. "No, forgive me. That was entirely too far. Your eyes are fine, Rigel. I think we've just about finished in here." Pansy retreated to rummage through her closet. Archie had all kinds of clothes, most of which Rigel hadn't even looked at, except to hang them up when Draco scolded her for leaving perfectly good fabric in her trunk. Pansy made a pleased noise at the diversity of choices and plucked 2 sets of robes from their hangers. "Why don't you ever wear these?" Pansy held each set against Rigel's neck in turn to gauge the effect of the colour against her skin. "I'd assumed you forgot to pack anything but school robes." "If I wear the same thing every day, I don't have to worry about what day it is." Pansy dove back into the closet and surfaced with a garish robe of lime green trimmed in orange. The horror in her eyes demanded an explanation. "Sirius has a disreputable sense of humour," Rigel offered. Pansy stared mutely at the floral pattern that upon closer inspection had fish heads where the petals should be. "He and my uncles have matching sets. Caution to anyone who considered inviting the Marauders anywhere. I'm sure it makes an excellent icebreaker." Pansy pushed the monstrosity into the back of the closet as though it were a live rat she would prefer to exterminate. "Not quite what I had in mind for today. This, on the other hand, should do nicely." Pansy handed her a set of robes that looked black to the casual eye, but were in fact a very dark grey. Rigel went into the bathroom to change and grimaced as the thin material slid over her head. The real reason she stuck to school robes was the added bulk they gave her. While her male classmates had not hit their growth spurts yet, one day they would, and Rigel didn't want to look delicate in comparison. When she returned, Draco had finally dragged himself from the arms of sleep. The blonde boy perched on the end of his bed, looking on with amusement as Pansy scowled fiercely at a rejected pile of shoes, which must have done something truly terrible to elicit such abhorrence. Shoes were the only thing she and Archie hadn't swapped. They had different-sized feet, and anyway, Rigel liked her boots. "What is this?" Pansy demanded. "It appears to be every shoe in my closet," Rigel said mildly. "They don't match anything here, and they're bulky." She said the last word as though it was a synonym for maggot. "They're protected against most types of acid," Rigel informed her, "not to mention fireproof, waterproof, and resistant to corrosion." "They may be serviceable," Pansy allowed, "but they don't go with the robes I picked out." "I could wear different robes." "Don't be ridiculous," Pansy turned to Draco. "We'll have to borrow some of yours." "You want my shoes?" This was a shade too far before breakfast, apparently. Draco put up his hands. "What's next, my underwear?" "Just for the morning," Pansy implored. "I'll see them clean myself before they're returned, and of course you're welcome to demand a similar favor in return." "I seriously doubt I'll be asking to borrow your shoes anytime soon. Thanks, though." Draco rolled his eyes. "And I'm sure the Hogwarts house elves don't need to be supervised when they clean shoes." "So you agree?" "Great." Pansy had her head in his trunk before he could blink. "Because I noticed you wearing a dove-grey pair last week that would be just perfect." "If they fit," Rigel said quietly. "He's right." Draco's cheeks took on a ruddy tinge that made him look even more sleep-rumpled. "I haven't fully grown into my height yet." "Oh, they're tiny." Pansy found the shoes she wanted, but eyed them uncertainly. "They're almost as small as mine." Rigel had been expecting the opposite problem. One of the many great things about boots was the way they added length and breadth to her feet, which were smaller than she thought a boy's should be. They fit almost perfectly, to Pansy's surprise and Draco's embarrassed relief. The soles were a bit wider than her foot, but the length was good, and even Rigel could see that they contrasted nicely with the dark robes. "Impeccable!" Pansy circled Rigel like a sculptor looking for something to chisel. "The symmetry between your eyes and your shoes really pulls it together. Doesn't he look like a proper pureblood, Draco?" "He looks rich, if that's what you mean." At Pansy's unamused look, Draco added, "I wouldn't think him out of place at one of Mother's luncheons." Rigel eyed her reflection in the wardrobe mirror uncomfortably. It might as well have been a painting. She couldn't see herself anywhere in the grey eyes, the perfectly tamed locks, the elegantly impractical robes, and the shoes, paper, thin and permeable, which would probably wilt if taken anywhere near an active cauldron. For a moment, she was terrified. Was this what it meant to chase a dream? Did she have to sacrifice her real self to find her would-be self? And even if she found it, if all her dreams become the facts of her reality, was there a way to get back to that dreamer unchanged? She didn't know, and that thought was enough to halt her thinking altogether. "Will you take the charm off of my hair now?" Rigel asked. "It's making my head feel a bit funny, I think." "It should be dry by now." Pansy lifted the charm and used her fingers to make the final adjustments. "Flawless. I'm afraid there's nothing more for me to do." Draco sighed gustily. "And we'll miss you terribly, but don't let the door hit you on the way out." "Good thing breakfast starts in 15 minutes, then." Pansy gathered her products with prim satisfaction. "You won't be bereft of my company for longer than it takes to wake Theo from his coma." The warning glare she sent Rigel as she paused by the door veritably dared her to change anything in her appearance before going to breakfast. Rigel smiled meekly. "Thank you, Pansy." After she'd gone, Draco flopped backwards on his bedcovers. "I can't remember which of us made friends with her first, but we are going to have a long 7 years. Never dull, though." Rigel tugged at the uncomfortable robes. "And when people look back at the pictures, I suppose we'll be the best-dressed ones in the frame." Draco wrinkled his nose. I'm sure one day I'll appreciate that, but right now I just wish I could have slept more. You, what about me? If you made more of an effort on an average day, Pansy wouldn't have had to intervene, would she? Draco drawled. Before Rigel could decide whether to throw one of her shoes at him, he levered himself off the bed and looked over at their roommate's 4-poster with a wicked glint. And instead of arguing about which one of us got less sleep this morning, as if it's even in dispute, we should be waking Theo so he can enjoy the fresh dungeon air as well. Rigel slid her eyes to Knott's light-cancelling curtains. A steady timbre of sickeningly comfortable breathing noises sounded within. "It is time for breakfast," she said slowly. "That's the spirit," Draco nudged her. "Practically doing him a favor, aren't we?" As she sat down to breakfast, Rigel found her rapport with the other girls in their year inexplicable, altered, which was to say, she appeared to suddenly have one. "Love your hair today, Black," Davis said with an appreciative flap of her eyelids. "Did your house elf finally deliver your trunk?" Greengrass guessed. Her eyes lingered on Rigel's robes in a way that was distinctly less comfortable than Pansy's critical appraisal. Pansy gave Rigel a less than subtle eyebrow raise. "See how much difference it makes?" Rigel had to tense her muscles to keep from spilling her milk when Davis put an unsolicited hand on her forearm. Rigel shot Pansy a look of panic. "I could do without this sort of difference, thank you very much." Pansy took pity on her. "Rigel is meeting some friends of mine after breakfast." Bulstrode grunted in understanding. "You did good." Her compliment was very much directed at Pansy, not Rigel. "Let me know how it goes." Now Rigel had to worry about why Bulstrode cared how her introduction went. A barn owl dropped Archie's long-awaited reply into Rigel's lap, and she wasted no time opening it. Anything was better than a table full of scrutiny. "Dear Rigel, I like the change. I was so glad to receive your letter. It's good to hear you're doing well at Hogwarts, though why anyone would want to go to that pretentious place I really don't understand. Brave of you to befriend a Malfoy after all Dad and Uncle Sirius have told us. As for Marcus Flint, you did tell me about him, remember? I specifically recall you describing him as rough around the edges, but much nicer than he looks when you told me about meeting him and his prejudiced father in the VIP box. You mentioned something about a troubled home life and a mother with a chronic illness, which was part of the reason you told him about your ambition to be a healer, wasn't it? And you said if I ever met him, I should try and look past the surface, which is mostly just a front. Am I remembering that right? Anyway, he sounds interesting, so perhaps I'll send him an owl and see if we can't all become good friends. My classes are going well, and my potions professor was especially impressed with my understanding of the art. I bet yours was too, considering how much of my knowledge must have rubbed off on you over the years. I don't think I'll have any problems learning healing here, and I hope you aren't too jealous of me. I'll share everything I learn with you over the summers, and it'll be like we're both in healer training. I've also made a friend, a Muggle-born witch who's also from England, Hermione Granger. She's terrifyingly brilliant, but also kind and loyal, and she wants to be a healer too. That's all so far. Imagine I said something sappy and heartfelt about missing you, etc. Harry. Rigel smiled fondly as she folded the letter and tucked it into her pocket. Archie would write to Flint, it seemed. She hoped he could cement an agreement to keep their secret safe indefinitely. "Letter from my cousin," she explained when Draco and Pansy sent her curious looks. Draco tilted his head. "Which cousin, Lestrange?" Rigel supposed he was mentally tracing the Black family tree, trying to decide who she'd be close enough in age to write to. He must be coming up blank if he thought she'd be corresponding with his aunt's kid. Sirius hated Bellatrix. Pansy cleared her throat delicately. "I think perhaps he meant a cousin in our year, attending a different magical school." "At Durmstrang?" Draco frowned. "But not Lestrange." Pansy widened her eyes meaningfully at Draco, who made an O of understanding with his mouth. "One of the schools on the continent, then? We have family over there, too. The Malfoys came over from France with the Norman conquest, you know." Rigel felt just a little vindictive as she burst his bubble. "No, not from the continent. She's British, but she attends the American Institute of Magic." Rigel witnessed the exact moment Draco realized the only British magical children who went to America were those who could not attend Hogwarts because of their blood status. He gave a faintly embarrassed, "Ah." Pansy looked between Draco's uncomfortable expression and Rigel's stiffly unapologetic posture and politely attended to her cup of tea. Rigel could almost see Draco groping around in his head for something non-inflammatory to say. She knew his family's politics all too well, and he might as well learn hers now before their friendship went further. "That would be the Potter heiress, I suppose. You must have spent some time together as children, with your fathers in business together." "That's right." Rigel tried to keep the defensiveness from her tone. "Harry and I grew up together." "Harriet Potter goes by Harry." Pansy abandoned any pretense of polite disinterest. "What's she like?" Rigel wasn't sure how to answer that. Pansy took her hesitation for confusion. "It's just, there aren't that many witches our age, and no one's seen her since she was a baby before the Potters stepped out of society." Stepped out was a diplomatic way to describe how the Potters and Blacks, along with every other lighter-lined family, had angrily turned their backs on dark pureblood society altogether in a politically motivated snub known as the Great Split. On Halloween night 1981, Lord Riddle orchestrated a civil coup of the Wizengamot. With enough supporters to form a quorum, the SOW party called an emergency session at midnight. Most of the opposing council members were observing the holiday, and therefore mysteriously and unfortunately missed their summons. In the absence of opposition, Riddle ruthlessly pushed through a packet of blood laws, including the one that reduced attendance at Hogwarts from purebloods and half-bloods to purebloods only. It wasn't just Hogwarts affected. One law, phrased as nationalist protection of local jobs, prevented anyone schooled outside of the UK from holding office in government or working for a public organisation. Another forbade any witch or wizard with creature blood from voting in wizarding elections or enlisting in a law enforcement agency. The worst was the change to Wizengamot procedure. The final law prevented the Wizengamot from overturning any previous legislation with less than a 3/4 majority. Even when the lighter-lined council members returned, there was nothing they could do. The families whose council members had been excluded from the vote were outraged, and in silent, furious protest, they had, 2-1, cut dark society altogether. Never since that night had the two sides mingled, except on neutral grounds. Rigel understood it was an incredibly sore point for most of the dark hostesses who suddenly had half the attendees at their balls and luncheons, but Pansy managed to reference it casually, as though the Great Split had not affected her at all. She also managed to make it sound as though dark society was the only one that mattered. "Harry is Harry," Rigel said eventually. "I don't know how to describe her." "Does she really have eyes as green as a serpent's polished scales?" Draco and Rigel exchanged a disbelieving look. "What?" Pansy had never looked so defensive. "That's what I heard." Draco gave a snort of laughter. "From who?" Pansy lifted her chin. "You know my mother is a poet." "A poor one," Bulstrode muttered from Draco's other side. Pansy pretended not to hear. "She met the Potter heiress when she was an infant. So are they?" "They are green," Rigel allowed, "though I don't know about as a serpent's whatever. She looks like any other Potter mostly, but the eyes are her mum's." "Lily Potter nee Evans, right?" Pansy knew her society, split or no split. "They say she was quite lovely." "She still is," Rigel agreed. "Aunt Lily is one of those people who never seems to age a day." "My mother is the same." Draco smiled, then paused, a frown growing as he realized he'd compared Narcissa Black with a woman of Muggle birth. "The mark of true beauty," Pansy said smoothly. "Were you and Miss Potter close as children?" "The closest," Rigel said. "My Uncle Remus doesn't have any children, so she was my only friend before I met you two. Godric's Hollow is an ageing community. Most of their neighbours were as old as Mrs. Bagshot. You must have been more like siblings than friends then," Pansy said thoughtfully. "We were. Harry's like my little sister, or maybe older sister, the way she mothers me." She could admit it easily. Archie needed mothering after all. "And now she's studying in America?" Bulstrode's eyes were sharp. "What's her specialty?" Rigel couldn't imagine why the stocky girl was interested. "She's in the healing track." AIM is known for that program, Bulstrode commented. It's a fast track for a certificate upon graduation, right? As long as she passes all the classes. Rigel hesitated but felt compelled to add, I don't know if she'll stick with it, though. Her real passion is potions. Then why is she in the healing track? It's the better program. She thinks it would be a shame not to take advantage, as long as she's there anyway. Rigel kept her tone light, as though it wasn't a crucial linchpin in their ruse. She'll keep studying potions in her own time, probably decide down the road which one she wants to pursue. Convoluted, but if someone learned that Harry had an interest in potions, it was explained, and when Archie and Harry eventually switched back, they would say that Harry decided healing wasn't for her at the last minute. Archie would take the healing exam under his own name once they'd graduated, saying that he'd been inspired by Harry's studies and decided to learn healing on his own. The trickiest part would be convincing everyone that Archie was in fact Archie, after Rigel had been him for so long. Rigel would have no trouble becoming Harry again because no one in society would know Harry at all. Their appearance was the major problem, but they still had time to figure that out. Mediwizardry is a noble profession, Pansy said. Though it'll be hard to get a job if she was schooled out of the UK, Draco added. Pansy sent him a repressing look. He shrugged it off. It's true, St. Mungo's is a public hospital. Harry will figure something out. Something like becoming a potions mistress and working for private development companies like her mum did. Will she remain in America then? Pansy asked. Rigel shrugged. I don't know all her plans. I thought you two were such close friends. There was a note of jealousy in Draco's voice. We're friends and I don't know your plans, Rigel said. Good point, Pansy grinned, especially since we don't know yours either. Rigel shrugged. I want to be a potions master, that's all there is to me. A group of people stood further down the table and Pansy suddenly abandoned her tea. It's time. Let's try to get there before them. Mordred forbid we make an older student wait, Draco muttered. All the same, he removed his napkin from his lap and stood. The three of them made it to the common room with time to spare for settling Rigel's hair one final time. Pansy arranged them in seats by one of the best fireplaces. They were a study in casual repose, only discredited by the way Pansy's eyes kept darting toward the entrance wall. I've known these two for years, Pansy said quietly to Rigel. Both eldest sons, both incredibly talented wizards, and they're best friends. Their personalities can be a bit... Her eyes shifted uncertainly. You'll see. They like to provoke people, but if they offend you, try not to show it. Rigel nodded. She didn't need reminding of the basic tenets of Slytherin. She hadn't been here long, but she wasn't unobservant. Why am I here again? Draco was beside Rigel on the low couch with Pansy catty-corner in a chair next to him. This put Rigel closest to the two empty chairs that would be taken by Pansy's friends. Pansy explained patiently. As Rigel's cousin, you are here in silent endorsement. If the Malfoys accept the black heir, then so must everyone else. Draco made a face. There's something unsavory about social maneuvering. Those at the top of the social food chain can afford to feel that way. Pansy's eyes held an edge that was normally wrapped in gossamer niceties. Others must reconcile themselves to the gentle game, no matter how repellent they find it to be at times. But you and Rigel aren't exactly bottom feeders, Draco protested. Why is it so important to push him into society right now? Rigel wanted to know that as well. Pansy gave them an exasperated look. You wait until now to ask? Honestly. She looked toward the entrance wall again. Rigel must be introduced to society while he's at school. When he's home, he is light-aligned under his father and thus subject to the split. School is a place of social neutrality, and it's his only chance to gain allies for the future. Opinions form quickly here. He's been keeping to himself too much the last 2 weeks. If Rigel wants to be accepted in our social circles going forward, if we want our friendship with Rigel to be accepted, we have to show everyone that he belongs here and has nothing to hide. Draco gave Rigel a shrewd look, but he does have things to hide. Rigel could not argue with that when she'd told him as much herself. No better way to hide things than by giving people no reason to go looking for them. Pansy took to her feet gracefully. Draco and Rigel a beat behind her. Two older boys approached the fireplace. They were of an age and height, though one was slightly taller. "Edmund, Alden, thank you for taking the time this morning." Pansy stepped forward with a genuine smile. "You have met Draco Malfoy, I believe?" The older Slytherins nodded politely to Draco, who nodded back. "Then may I introduce my classmate, Rigel Black?" Pansy turned her head to indicate Rigel, who kept her expression neutral as she received their regard. "Rigel, this is Alden Rosier and Edmund Rookwood. How do you do, Black?" Rookwood, the taller of the two, had light brown hair cut close to his head. He tilted his head in a nod that accentuated his square jaw, managing to convey friendliness without the hint of a smile. "Well, thank you." Rigel took his hand, and it transferred a pleasant warmth despite the dungeon air. Rosier, slighter and more beautiful, took her hand before Rookwood had even fully released her. "Our meeting is overdue." His hair was so black it skewed blue. Gold eyes gleamed with preternatural interest, and she thought he looked like a shadow next to his rock statue of a friend. The flickering amusement in his eyes only enhanced the impression of light in a dark room. "I'm sorry we couldn't arrange something sooner," Rigel said, her face a mask of polite interest. Pansy sat first, followed by Draco. Rookwood chose the single seat opposite Pansy, and Rosier moved smoothly to the third space on the couch. Rigel had no choice but to sit between him and Draco, trying to keep her posture straight enough to avoid cutting anyone out of the conversation. "I'm so pleased this worked out. I've been meaning to introduce you all since the start of term." Pansy's words were formal, but she injected such emotion into each syllable that it was hard to doubt her sincerity. "So, thank you for taking the time. I know you're busy." "I cannot think of anyone too busy to spend a few moments with you, Pansy." If a mountain had a voice, strong and staid, it would have been Rookwood's. The dull rumble was dangerous, Rigel decided. It had a lulling quality that belied the penetrating effect of his gaze. Half-lidded, he seemed to cast a transparency charm on everything before him. Or maybe that was just Rigel. "We wouldn't miss it, though, as lowly fourth years. Our schedules are hardly hard-pressed to accommodate anything," Rosier added. Pansy accepted their flattery like a queen accepting a bow. Draco laughed lightly. A sound so patently out of character, Rigel had to check someone else hadn't taken his seat. "Oh, don't tell her that. She'll be expecting Rigel and me to be equally accommodating with our time now." "And why shouldn't you be?" Pansy asked, eyebrows raised playfully. "If we spoil you, you're liable to get out of hand," Rigel said, figuring she may as well participate in the banter since Pansy had gone to so much trouble to arrange everything. "A woman is always out of hand," Rosier said slyly, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees. "Though she may never be long out of mind," Rookwood added, leaning back in his chair as though in counterbalance. Rigel had to admit they were good. Pansy feigned pique at being singled out, but she couldn't hide her relief that the ice was melting. "Your studies must be progressing smoothly if you've enough time to spend the morning teasing me." "As smoothly as can be expected before we settle into career paths," Rosier said. "Are you considering anything in particular?" Rigel asked, projecting interest into the question. She could socialize, it wasn't that hard. "I may pursue a mastery in experimental magical theory at some point after graduation," Rosier said idly, as though that was not an incredibly difficult specialty. "But Edmund is more interested in hands-on work, aren't you?" "I prefer the minding of magical plants and animals to the likes of arithmancy, yes." Rookwood rolled his shoulder in a one-man landslide. "One of my uncles works on an international creatures reserve, so I'm applying for an internship there next summer. If it suits me, I might look at working with dragons or hydras in the future." "You both have such specific ideas," Pansy said wistfully. "I hope my future is as clear by the beginning of fourth year." "Don't worry if nothing strikes a chord at first," Rookwood said. "The basics in every subject are fairly dull." Draco nudged Rigel good-naturedly. "Tell that to this one. He had his future picked out before he walked onto the Hogwarts Express." Their attention turned to Rigel. "Is that so? What will you do when you graduate, then?" Rosier's mouth held an amused twist at the edges. She tried not to let it faze her. Maybe it was overconfident to plan her life at 11, but if she wanted something, why shouldn't she go after it? The world wasn't going to hand it to her. Because he had asked what she would do, rather than what she wanted to do, she gave him the courtesy of an honest answer. "I'm going to be a potions master." The older Slytherins exchanged a look. Rigel wondered if they had been expecting her to say something like aura or prank inventor. When they refocused on her, their eyes had grown more intent, as though they were only now fully engaged in the conversation. "A challenging subject," Rookwood noted. "The potions mastery is rumoured to be among the most difficult to obtain. Rigel is up to the challenge." The confidence Draco radiated sent a bit of warmth straight into her chest. Rosier noted it too, a glowing endorsement. Rigel couldn't tell if it was her imagination or if his eyes really lingered laughingly over her pink-tinged cheekbones when he said, "Glowing?" Pansy wasn't kidding about her friend having a needling disposition. "And perfectly apartment," Pansy threw in her support without an ounce of subtlety. "Professor Snape has already begun giving Rigel extra tutelage." Another fathomless look passed between Rosier and Rookwood. "Professor Snape's judgment is incontestable," Rosier said slowly. "As I understand it, he does not share his talents lightly." "My friends are too kind," Rigel demurred. "At the moment, Professor Snape just assigns me a lot of extra work." Rosier laughed. "That sounds like him." "That you have gained his notice at all is still impressive," Rookwood offered. "It's only been 2 weeks. You must have nursed this ambition for some time before coming to Hogwarts." Rosier made a noise of understanding. "And long-term ambition would go a long way toward explaining your presence in Slytherin." "I wasn't aware that it needed explaining." Rosier smiled. "Weren't you? A great many people are curious about you, Black. They want to know on which side of the wand you'll fall." "If I do land on one side or the other, rest assured it will be because I jumped." "I like this one, Pansy." Rosier didn't take his eyes off Rigel's expressionless face. "Yes, bring him around more often," Rookwood agreed. The upperclassmen stood, each nodding to Draco and bowing over Pansy's hand gracefully. "Until we meet again, Black." Rosier favoured Rigel with a sly grin, while Rookwood restrained himself to a polite nod. "Good day, Rookwood, Rosier." Rigel nodded respectfully to each of them, then sat slowly back down on the couch once they'd walked away, extremely relieved that the meeting was over. "That went so well," Pansy beamed at her. "Alden and Edmund have a lot of pull among the upper years. You've made wonderful allies today, Rigel." "I understand why you wanted me to meet them, but why did they seem so pleased to meet me?" Rigel asked. "Everyone wants to bring éclat to their own family name, and the best way to do that, short of becoming distinguished through your own merits, is to make good connections. You have talent and ambition, not to mention an old family name, so there will never be a shortage of people desiring to connect themselves to you. But everyone in Slytherin is ambitious. Surely they'll all want to be the sought after, rather than the seeking," Rigel said, a bit confused. "No reason not to do both?" Pansy smirked. "Then you have twice the clout? Now we only have to hope Alden and Edmund write to their parents about you. If that happens, their mothers will write to my mother and Draco's mother, and will be practically ordered to be friends with you." "Oh, that's good." Had Pansy really planned for all of that to happen? No wonder she insisted on the meeting well before the first Quidditch match. "It's all taken care of," Pansy assured her. "Not that we would have dropped you even if the whole house was against you, but this does make the situation easier for us. If the politicking is settled, let's do something more productive with the rest of our morning." Draco stretched as though he'd been on the couch for hours rather than 15 minutes. "Exploding snap?" Rigel begged out of the card game, citing homework. Draco was determined to put his off to later in the evening, and Pansy's designs for her had been so well satisfied that she didn't even press when Rigel left for the library. She used her Ravenclaw disguise, which involved the brown wig and the same pair of common round glasses. As she shuffled through the stacks with poor posture, she wondered whether she wouldn't be good enough to take up acting by the time she figured out how to convince Pince to let her in of her own accord. Flint had included the graded assignments from the previous week in his latest letter, and Rigel took full advantage of the comments to avoid making the same mistakes twice. That week was lighter on assignments, but several hours later she was still stuck on an essay about vanishing theory. The concepts involved seemed contradictory, and she wasn't sure how to reconcile them. Rigel got the feeling transfiguration, unlike history or herbology, was cumulative. Year 5 wasn't just tackling more complicated subject matter, it required the foundation of the 4 previous years to understand. Unable to move forward, she decided it was time to take Percy Weasley up on his offer. Rigel climbed directly to Gryffindor Tower. The main staircase reminded her she hadn't been alone in the corridors since Friday's incident, and she found her feet moving faster and her breath coming shorter than even a handful of staircases merited. At the fat lady's portrait, she took a moment to regain her composure. "Visiting?" the portrait asked, eyeing her tie. Rigel smiled guiltily and slid the wig off of her head, stowing it in her bag with the glasses. She knocked on the lady's opulent frame, and a girl with blonde curly hair stuck her head out a moment later. "What's up?" Her tone was neither friendly nor rude. "Is Percy Weasley around?" Rigel asked. "He offered to help me with some extracurricular study." At the word study, the curious expression left her face, and she gave a bored nod. "Yeah, come on in." She pushed open the painting, and Rigel climbed carefully through the opening. "Prefect Weasley is over there." She gestured to a long study table tucked into a niche between 2 sets of stairs. Percy sat alone, up to his shoulders in books and running ink-stained fingers through his fireball of hair. "He's been in a right state since lunch," the curly-haired girl informed her. "Good luck with that." Rigel thanked her and cautiously approached Percy's barricade of books. He was either writing an essay or angrily destroying an innocent sheet of parchment. "Percy!" She spoke quietly, but he still jumped as though she'd shouted. "What? Who? Oh, Rigel, hello." He rubbed a hand against his face, knocking his horn-rimmed glasses askew. "How are you?" "Very well, thank you." She recognized a few of the books Percy had stacked about him. "Working on a potions essay?" "Yes." He scowled down at the mess of ink and parchment before him. "Or I was, before potions decided to become ancient Mesopotamian. This dratted assignment doesn't make any sense." He tossed down his quill with a sigh. "Did you come for help with something? I need a break from this anyway." Rigel moved a pile of crumpled parchment from a chair and sat. "I was hoping you could explain vanishing theory to me. It was mentioned in a book I was reading, so I looked it up, but I don't understand parts of it." "Oh?" Percy looked interested. "That's very advanced theory. We're only just now getting into it, in fact." Rigel tried not to fidget guiltily. "What are you having trouble with?" "I don't understand where things go when they are vanished. The book says they go into non-being." "But what is that, like another dimension?" Rigel asked. "Non-being is a kind of theoretical place from which all of being comes out of. It's not really another dimension, since other dimensions are just a different kind of being. Rather, it's the opposite of things that are. Vanished objects don't exactly go there, but they become the opposite of being. That is, they unbecome. And once they aren't being anymore, they are a part of non-being. Do you see?" Percy raised his eyebrows expectantly. "Not really." Rigel frowned. "If they don't exist anymore, then how is it possible to get the objects back by unvanishing them?" "Oh, well, it's all theoretical," Percy began slowly. "But you don't really have to understand the physics of it to grasp the theory. Basically, just realize that you aren't destroying whatever you vanish. It's not that kind of unbecoming. More like you're giving it the property of lacking presence in this world. It's still the same as it was before you vanished it, only it isn't here anymore, so it's considered non-being in that sense. The key is in distinguishing between non-being and non-existence. An object in non-being exists. It just doesn't exist in being at the moment. That's why you can retrieve a vanished object if you know how." "So, a vanishment is conditionally temporary?" Rigel asked. "Yes, that's usually the case." Percy paused. "Well, unless it's in true non-being." Rigel stared at him. "What is true non-being, then? Even more non-being?" "It is the combination of non-being and non-existence. True non-being is really, truly gone. No getting something back," Percy elaborated. All right. She could accept that if she didn't think too hard about it. Rigel carefully jotted down the phrase, property of lacking presence, so she didn't forget it. I'm confused about another thing. Percy gestured for her to go on. I've read that in Apparition, for example, where a wizard vanishes and unvanishes himself in two different locations, it's possible for the wizard to splinch himself without killing himself, which suggests that the connection between vanished parts of an object can survive the vanishment. Do you think it's possible that it might work the same for linked charms? A bad splinching often results in a severing of that connection, Percy corrected her. Not everyone gets put back together without issue. That said, explain your idea about linked charms. If you vanished an object with a link to something in being, say you vanished one of the monitoring orbs healers use while it was still linked to the person it was monitoring, and then you unvanished it 2 hours later, would you have data for those 2 hours? Would the orb continue to work as a linked object in non-being if it remains unchanged in non-being? Well, I don't know why it wouldn't, but you should ask Professor McGonagall in class if you really want to be sure, he said. Would you mind asking her for me? I don't want to seem like I'm showing off by reading ahead. Percy gave her a wry smile. I'm curious myself, so I don't mind, but you shouldn't hide your intellect to impress your peers. For one, it won't work. I'll keep that in mind. Can I ask one more thing? Rigel smiled apologetically, but Percy didn't seem to mind at all. Apparition is just the vanishment and unvanishment of a person, but with different spatial dimensions used for the unvanishment than were used in the original vanishment, right? That's one way to look at it, Percy acknowledged. Go on. So, if we consider that an object's location in being is the result of its intersection point on the spatial temporal grid, then, if it's possible to vanish something across the spatial plane, shouldn't it be possible to also vanish things across the other? You mean time travel? Percy tilted his head. Yes, could you vanish an object into the past, for example? I don't know, Rigel. If it were banishing, the answer would be a definite no. But vanishings aren't limited to moving through consecutive points on a plane. It might be that apparition only works because the wizard is the vanished object and therefore able to unvanish himself in a different spatial location. I'm not sure if you could send an object somewhere specific across the spatial or temporal barrier because you'd have no control once it was vanished. Without any controlling parameters, an unvanished object reappears where it was vanished, but I suppose with a runic array prepared in advance you could force it to reappear anywhere. He trailed off, thinking hard. A wizard would have to be impossibly powerful to vanish themselves across the temporal barrier anyway, wouldn't they? Rigel asked. I should think so, Percy said, but I'll ask McGonagall about that too, if you like. Thanks. Rigel shook her head. It's so difficult to figure all this out. Your grasp of it isn't bad so far, Percy said kindly. I understand it much better now. Thanks for your help. No problem. Percy straightened his glasses. I think I understand it better after explaining it, actually, and anything is better than wading through this mess. He gestured to the scattered notes in front of him. She considered the battlefield of books and splatters of ink. She could have left. Percy wouldn't have begrudged her. The older boy would never expect recompense, but as she took in his hopeless expression, she knew that Archie would have tried to help him, and that decided her. What's the essay on? Potion fusion, Percy sighed. Professor Snape assigned everyone 2 potions, and we're supposed to imagine a person who needs to take both at the same time and figure out what needs to be changed about the dosages and ingredients in order to make them both compatible and effective. It's a nightmare, and Professor Snape always gives me the trickiest assignments because he thinks I'm an uninspired, fact-grasping know-it-all. Rigel raised her eyebrows. Percy flushed. That's what he wrote on my last paper. Ah. Rigel took another look at the books on the table. Well, the first problem is you're reading Bonagage. He hardly ever gets anything right. Percy looked at her as though she'd grown horns. I read potions journals, Rigel said, and the general consensus among the academic community is that Bonagage is a blithering idiot who wouldn't know knotgrass from fluxweed if he had to wipe his arse with them. If you cite him in your essay, Snape probably won't even read it. Percy blinked several times before resolutely pushing the book in question away from him. Could I borrow those journals sometime? He asked politely. Sure, but for now, what potions did you get? Rigel scooted her chair closer to peer at his notes. Skilligrew and blood replenishing potion. You know much about potions, Rigel? Yeah, I love potions, she said easily. What have you worked out so far? Well, the biggest trouble is with the blood root from the blood replenishing potion, which reacts badly with the skullcap flowers in Skilligrew. Then there's the huge amount of nettle leaves needed for Skilligrew, which tend to explode when placed in dragon bile. Unfortunately, blood replenishing potion is brewed on a dragon bile base. Percy pursed his lips. Also, the ginger and the cayenne used in Skilligrew to burn infection away are blood thinners and circulators, both of which would be very bad to give to someone who's possibly bleeding. Having suffered a wound, they'd need to take blood replenishing potion for. That is a tricky one. Rigel tapped her finger against the table as she ran through the combinations in her mind. What have you tried tweaking? At first, I thought I could use willow bark instead of bloodroot for the blood replenisher, but willow bark needs to stew for over an hour, which is too long to leave the vervain in without rendering the whole thing undrinkable. I can't just leave the vervain until last, either, because it has to go in at the same time as the hypericum flowers, which must go in straight after the St. Stuart's Bane in order to bond properly to the dissolving stalks. Percy recited it all with a tone of weary defeat. Why not use a different painkiller besides willow bark? Rigel asked. Any of the others that I've come across so far have reacted violently with the trillium, which I can't take out of the Skilligrew without causing the drinker's muscles to cramp around the growing bones and make them regrow crookedly, Percy said. What about feverfew? Rigel flipped through one of the herbal indexes on the table, but she couldn't find feverfew listed in it. Is that an anaesthetic? Percy frowned. It's not in any of these. Yes, it's a rather hairy flower that grows in southeast Europe, Rigel said. It'll work as a painkiller if you use enough of it. You need about 3 times as much feverfew as you would bloodroot, but it would go easily with the skullcap flowers, I think. You're sure about this? Percy glanced at her apologetically. You seem very bright, but Professor Snape already hates me. What have you got to lose? Rigel smiled. Incidentally, feverfew also prevents platelets from clumping, so it's really perfect for a blood-replenishing potion. Percy laughed, but wrote it down nonetheless. All right, Rigel, what else have you got for me? I think you should consider replacing the ginger and cayenne with oat straw, Rigel said. Oat straw? Percy's lips twisted wryly. Something else that's definitely not in any of these indexes. What does that one do? It's an anti-inflammatory, which never hurts, and it's rolling in calcium and other vitamins. It will act as a thickening agent, but you can combat that by adding twice as much chimera milk. Seriously, she added as Percy hesitated once more, cows eat oat straw all the time, so you know it's good for bones. I'll be sure to tell Professor Snape that. He shook his head, scribbling away. But what will burn out infections if we take the ginger and cayenne out? We already added feverfew to the blood-replenishing potion, Rigel said. Even though the Skilligrew itself won't have anything to ward off infection, if you're giving them to the person at the same time, it won't matter. Percy smiled slowly. That's brilliant, except for the nettle leaves, Rigel grimaced. I know. They're as important to Skilligrew as the dragon bile is to the blood replenisher. You could maybe mimic the effect by adding about 2 tons of rosemary. But the rosemary would mix with the St. Stuart's Bane and make the person vomit both potions back up, so it's useless, Percy said. Professor Snape really does hate you. Percy snorted. Could be worse. I heard he gave Oliver Wood amortentia and wolfsbane. In what situation would you ever have to administer both amortentia and wolfsbane at the same time? Rigel wrinkled her nose. It would have to be a werewolf, or the wolfsbane would just poison them, and you'd have to be insane to want a soon-to-be wolf to fall obsessively in lust with you on the night of the full moon, unless the amortentia was brewed with the essence of your worst enemy. Percy let out a burst of laughter, causing several people in the common room to turn and stare. I'll tell Oliver to write his essay on that. They flipped through the ingredient indexes, throwing out suggestion after suggestion, until Percy shut his book and laid his glasses down on top of it, massaging his forehead. "I just don't see how you can take the nettle leaves out of Skelegro. It's impossible." Rigel sat up straighter. "Maybe you're not supposed to. Maybe you just have to alter the nettles so that they don't react with the dragon bile. But in doing that, you would also be stripping the nettles of their regenerative properties, which is the entire point," Percy argued. "What if it was like a vanishing, but opposite?" Rigel said excitedly. "What?" Percy put his glasses back on. "Temporarily conditional." "Explain," Percy demanded, quill poised over his notes. "When a person drinks blood-replenishing potion, what happens to the dragon bile? It gets rejected and drained from the stomach almost immediately, so at most you have about 2 minutes that the nettles are dangerous, if reactive. We coat the nettle leaves with ephedra oil right before we put them into the base. Ephedra oil is non-reactive, extremely mild, but it disperses naturally. When it bonds with dissolved mullein root," Percy was grinning now too, "so we add whole stalks of mullein root to either of the potions, and when the blood-replenishing potion is ingested, the dragon bile will be drained out before the mullein root fully dissolves, and by the time the ephedra oil is gone and the nettles are active again, there's no dragon bile left to react with. It's genius." Rigel grinned as she watched Percy's quill fly across the page at full speed. "Perfect. It all works out perfectly," he muttered. "Rigel, oh, Rigel." He remembered her presence and blinked at her. "I don't know how to thank you, but this is—" Rigel waved off his thanks. "It was no trouble. I like potions, and you helped me a ton with vanishing theory." "Still," he said, practically beaming, "I'm going to show Professor Snape this time, and I couldn't have done it without you. Any time you need help with anything, day or night, just come and find me." "Thanks, Percy." "Oi, Percy!" someone called frantically from the portrait hole. "You better get down to the 4th floor. Your brothers—" "Merlin, what have they done now?" Percy stood, glancing distractedly at the cluttered table. "I'll look after your stuff for you until you get back," Rigel offered. "Will ya?" He straightened his robes briskly and headed for the portrait hole. "One of these days I'm going to owl Mum about those two." Rigel pulled out the transfiguration essay she was writing for Flint. She was near the owlery already, so she may as well get it done and mailed before the weekend was over. 30 minutes later, she had a completed essay on vanishing theory and had begun to poke through the potions books on the table, a couple of which she hadn't read cover to cover. She was starting to wonder if Percy had been caught up in a horrible prank when she was pulled from her reading by a familiar voice. Strange place to do your homework, isn't it? Rigel looked up as Lee Jordan claimed the seat across from her. "Isn't this a study table?" "In the Gryffindor common room," Jordan laughed. "You're something else, kid." "If you say so. I'm not the only one." Jordan leaned back until his chair was balanced on the back 2 legs. "The twins talk about you all the time." "Do they?" Rigel didn't know what he wanted her to make of that. "Sure, but that's the Weasley twins for you." Jordan shrugged. "Always going on about something new. They get tired of things pretty quickly, though, everything except one another." "And you too," Rigel said. "You've been their friend for years, haven't you?" "Can you be friends with a force of nature?" Jordan stared across the common room listlessly. "Sometimes I don't know. I used to think we were in it for the long haul, but they've been keeping secrets, hiding things from me." "Everyone hides things," Rigel pointed out. "Don't you?" Jordan looked startled, as though he hadn't considered whether or not his judgment could be turned back on himself. "Friendship doesn't have to mean no secrets." At least she hoped it didn't. His gaze drifted again. "Still, when it comes down to it, the twins only ever look toward each other." Rigel said nothing, not wanting to put more of her opinions in the middle of what was obviously a complex relationship. She needn't have worried. As inexplicably as he'd joined her, Jordan stood and said, "Don't let them wear you out." Rigel stared after him, feeling vaguely unsettled. As though summoned by demonic ritual, the twins appeared at the portrait hole not a minute after Jordan had left through it, grinning like stuffed canaries, even as their older brother dragged himself wearily into the room after them. The eldest Weasley made straight for her table, ignoring his brother's attempts to cajole him into accepting their apologies. As he approached, Rigel noticed Percy's prefect badge was spitting confetti with every third step he took. "Honestly, Perce," Fred was saying, hand over his heart, "that spell was meant to hit the Slytherin prefect, not you, and that makes it better." Percy scowled as confetti rained down over his books and papers. "You can't just go around pranking prefects for no reason. How does it look? My own brothers, the biggest source of insubordination since—" "Whoa, who said we did it for no reason? It's not our fault, we're the generals in this—" "Rigel." George had spotted her behind Percy's stack of books. "Puppy!" Fred cried cheerfully, bounding over to snag a seat next to her. George wasted no time in claiming the seat on her right, leaving Percy to sit across from them. Instead, Percy began packing up his things. "May as well finish this in my room for all the work I'll get done with these two around. See you, Rigel, and thanks again." "Any time," Rigel said. "See you around." With a short nod, Percy trudged off to one of the many staircases, a trail of confetti in his wake. "So, what could a first-year Slytherin possibly be helping our brother the perfect prefect with?" George asked. "And don't bother lying, we can always tell," Fred said. "Percy and I have an arrangement of mutual academic gain," Rigel said loftily. "Therefore, as his newfound ally, I must ask whether you really did make his badge belch confetti on purpose. If so, please don't tell him I also asked you what spell it was. I've never seen it before, and I've seen a lot of pranking spells." Fred and George laughed. "A happy accident," Fred said proudly. "The target, not the spell," George clarified. "Why were you pranking a Slytherin prefect, then? Haven't you heard?" George waggled his eyebrows. "Slytherin and Gryffindor are in a prank war, so naturally our services have been enlisted. It started Friday night. I suppose you don't know why?" Rigel frowned. Was that what the older Slytherins meant when they promised her attack would be answered? "Surely not." "You have been martyred," Fred teased. "They're saying you, a poor first year, were viciously set upon by a cowardly Gryffindor while innocently walking through the dungeons past curfew on Friday night. The Slytherins have sworn revenge against any and all Gryffindors who cross their path." George shook his head, as if they needed to come up with such an elaborate, "I told them not to" excuse. Fred and George both stared at her, and she wasn't sure which one she was supposed to look at. "Hang on, are you saying you really were attacked?" Fred frowned. "We thought they just wanted a reason to have a go at us." Rigel pressed her lips together. "You were attacked again." George's eyes went flat. "Who was it?" "I don't know. I told the older Slytherins I didn't know, and they insisted on assuming it was a Gryffindor anyway." Rigel ran her right hand through her hair. "Now there's a house war over it. That's only going to draw more attention." Fred and George exchanged a look over her head. "How many times have you been targeted? Be honest." Rigel tallied them in her head. There was the first incident where she broke her wrist, the one where she got trapped in a trick stare and dung-bombed, and then the stinging hex. 3, I think. "You think?" Fred prompted. "Well, I sort of thought someone was following me between classes one day, but they didn't shoot a spell at me," she admitted. Zabini didn't offer the identity of the blonde butterfly, so she assumed he didn't think that was related to her attacker. Then again, how well did she know Zabini? "Merlin! Rigel!" George rapped his fingers on the table in a quick drum. "All right. First of all, you have a stalker. And second of all, we're walking you back to your common room tonight." "Tonight?" Rigel craned her neck to look for a window. "What time is it?" "It's nearly 7:30. George told her. "How long did Percy chain you to this desk?" "Long enough to worry my friends," she said, packing up her bag quickly. "I can't believe I missed dinner again." Fred shrugged, standing as well. "We'll stop by the kitchens on the way down." "Can we stop by the owlery, too? I have some letters I'd rather mail while I'm already up here." "Better you go with us anyway, considering how steep the owlery stairs are," George said darkly. "Let me see your wrist." Rigel offered it up for inspection. "I don't suppose you could cast another of those numbing spells. It still aches a bit." "It shouldn't," George frowned as Fred unwrapped her bandages. "It looks like it hasn't healed much," Fred said, checking her range of motion. Either something is preventing your magic from helping it heal, or the injury's been treated so roughly that your body can barely keep it from worsening. He stared at her expectantly. She looked away. George sighed, but he cast the numbing spell without pressing further. If the pain persists, find one of us to recast it for you. Yes, Healer George. You mean Healer Fred? Fred corrected her as he rewrapped the bandage. I'm Healer George. Whatever you say, Fred. This one's clever, Forge. Fred ruffled her hair, intentionally mussing it. Didn't you see the tie, Gred? George tugged on Rigel's Ravenclaw accessory. Fred eyed it appreciatively. I was wondering how you'd managed to stay unharassed all afternoon while we're in the middle of a prank war. It's not as impressive once you know the trick. Rigel sent George an admonishing look. You've shattered the illusion. I'll buy him a new one when I'm rich and famous. George smiled. They made for the owlery, Fred and George taking their role as bodyguards a bit too far and scaring the wits out of Lee Jordan as he came around the corner. He declined their invitation to join them, saying he was headed to a game of exploding snap. And after that, the twins refrained from shooting firecrackers at anyone they came across unexpectedly. When they neared the owlery, Rigel asked, Would you mind waiting for me here? How can we stop miscreants from toppling you down the icy... They won't be icy in mid-September. And treacherous stairs if we aren't on the stairs with you? How about we wait at the top of the stairs and cover our ears while you reveal the secrets of the universe to your owl? George offered. It's not that I don't trust you guys, she started. Fred cut her off good-naturedly. We're teasing. Everybody has secrets. She smiled, recalling her words to Jordan not an hour before. Personally, I wouldn't trust Gred either, George stage-whispered. But I'll keep a close watch on him. Me? Fred clutched at non-existent pearls. Don't believe these slanderous lies, Rigel. He's the one you have to watch out for. Ask anyone. They'll all tell you Fred's the evil twin. George shot Rigel a glance that was brimming with exasperated fondness. Isn't he wonderful in the strangest way? Rigel grinned back, and Fred sighed as he caught on. Oh, right, you already guessed I was Fred today, didn't you? I'm afraid so, Rigel said. I do think you're wonderful, though. They reached the top of the stairs, and Rigel ducked inside while George and Fred took up positions on either side of the doorway like sentinels. Rigel rolled the new essays for Flint together and made separate bundles for her replies to Remus, Sirius, and Archie. As she was tying the first roll, Fred began a particularly spirited rendition of A Cauldron Full of Hot Strong Love. George joined in counterpart just as exuberantly, and Rigel worked quickly to finish before they brought the whole roost down. I'll boil you up some Fred caught an elbow in the stomach when George saw her coming out. Oh, that was fast. Someone had to save those owls from insanity. Too late to insult us now. George linked his arm through her elbow carefully, avoiding her wrist. Fred took up her other side. We've already figured out you like us. Rigel silently resigned herself to a life with more than one friend. At the rate she was earning new ones, she'd never be able to get rid of them all. Fred and George hung back as they reached the entrance hall, and Rigel got the distinct feeling she was being tested. As she turned toward the stairs to the kitchens, they gave one another matching grins. Only the second week, and he knows where the kitchens are. Took us 3. We'll have to watch this one, lest he usurp our reign. I want nothing to do with your reign. That's not what Lee thinks. He thinks you're hiding a pranking genius under a facade of disinterest to lull us into complacency. Fred chuckled, as if that would ever work. We're unlullable, George agreed. Rigel tickled the pair. I can only imagine your mother's despair. They were barely through the door when a wave of house elves set upon the twins. Fred and George mingled happily with the elves, who seemed eager to help with any task the twins might have brought them. They greeted many elves by name and were offered a steady procession of food in exchange. The offerings went into a bottomless bag they seemed to have brought in anticipation of the gifts, but one elf veered from the group and held a platter of strawberries up to Rigel instead. You is liking these? Binny smiled as she plopped her tiny form on the bench next to Rigel. Binny, Rigel gave the blushing elf a warm handshake. I love strawberries, thank you, and thanks for the help with the you-know-what the other day. Do we know? I don't believe we do. Rigel and Binny affected innocent expressions as the twins leaned over their table. Making deals with house elves? George sighed despairingly. I hope you got it in writing, because Binny here is notoriously difficult to pin down when the blood starts flying. Young sir ought not to be saying such things. Binny wagged her finger, but a smile tugged at her lips. That's right, Forge. We were sworn to silence, remember? Fred looked over his shoulder in exaggerated fear. You don't want to go the same way as the other guy, do you? What other guy? George asked. The one who disappeared the same week the elves started serving lumpy gravy. Rigel gave Binny a dubious look. I is not knowing what you is talking about, the elf said solemnly. Binny is never ever serving gravy with suspicious lumps. Such a thing is being vicious slander. Fred and George collapsed onto the bench with laughter, and Binny gave a dainty curtsy as she stood. Is you wanting anything else? Rigel missed dinner, George said, wiping at his eyes. Several house elves in the immediate vicinity gasped. Rigel watched with wide eyes as a plate piled high with vegetables, fruits, nuts, breads and cheeses appeared before her. A pitcher of apple juice joined it a moment later. Her stomach gave a battle cry, and she descended on the food with abandon. You a vegetarian, puppy? Fred glanced over the selection bemusedly. I am, she said between bites. How'd they know? The house elves know everything, George said. She hoped that wasn't true. When she could eat no more, they took their leave, Rigel promising to visit Binny again soon. Fred and George walked her as far as the potions classroom, but there they came to a reluctant stop. We probably shouldn't go further, but I'm in snake territory now, Rigel assured them. I'll be fine from here. You were attacked in the dungeons 2 nights ago, George reminded her dryly. And I got away because it wasn't a Slytherin who attacked me, she reasoned. When they exchanged hesitant looks, she smiled. Don't worry, I'm a fast runner. You shouldn't have to run from anything, Fred said, not at Hogwarts. They'd be surprised how much there was to run from at Hogwarts. The truth, for one. Oi! Adrian Pusey and Lucian Bowl came striding toward them, bristling in aggressive postures. What's a pair of griffins doing so far from their tower? Bowl tossed his long black hair over his shoulder and looked down his nose at the griffin doors. George rolled his eyes and Fred yawned dramatically. These two bothering you, Black? Pusey looked her over, but relaxed only slightly when she appeared to be in good health. They were looking out for me, actually, Rigel said. They heard about the attack on Friday and wanted to make sure I got back to the common room safely. You were going to lead them straight to our common room? You stupid... Luke, they already know where it is, Pusey said. And they were just leaving me here in any case, Rigel muttered. Bowles sneered disagreeably. You've got some nerve showing your faces down here if you heard about the attack. Well, someone ought to watch out for your first years if you can't. George had no sense of self-preservation, apparently. Before Bowl could hex him, Rigel reminded them, we don't know it was a Gryffindor who attacked me anyway. Fred clapped a hand on her shoulder. If it turns out it was, we'll be the first to defect to the Slytherin camp. Reckon you should be safe from staircases in the dungeons, at least, George said idly. Night, Rigel. Fred waved sarcastically to the older Slytherins as he and his brother retreated up the corridor, not turning their backs until they reached the corner. Pusey gave Rigel a hard-to-read look. Interesting taste in allies, Black. Don't trust those two. What did he mean about staircases? Bowl demanded. Somehow she didn't think they would be reassured by her explanation. We hope you enjoyed this chapter. Please consider supporting our project by joining our Patreon linked in the description, or become a member here on YouTube, where you will get access to several additional chapters weeks before they release on YouTube.